Good morning, everybody. Hey, we are continuing in the series on Jesus' I am statements. And we're going to be looking at a passage from John chapter 6. And I encourage you to get your Bibles and turn there, John chapter 6, or if you got your app, whatever it is, but find that spot. This past Christmas, Lori's sister called her, had a great idea. Sister's name is Angie, and Angie said, "Hey, Lori, why don't you and Chris and Mark and I not exchange gifts this year, but instead let's just take the money that we would spend on normally giving each other gift cards, and let's just go out to eat at a nice restaurant, just the four of us. We haven't done that in a long time." And so we did that. We went down to Tennessee, and the only problem with that was that we had to decide where to go, right? So have you ever been locked in this endless loop with your spouse? Where do you want to go? I don't care. Where do you want to go? It doesn't matter to me. Where do you want to go? I don't care. I'll go what you pick. I'll go wherever you want to go. No, I don't want to go there, but I'll go anywhere you want to go, right? But luckily for us, it was solved pretty easily because we both had from various sources gift cards to one of my favorite restaurants. And so we went to this place in Knoxville called the Cheesecake Factory. Have you been to Cheesecake Factory? Raise your hand if you've been there. Just curious. Yeah. So I like Cheesecake Factory a lot. I really like cheesecake, but what I found out the first time that I went there, and by the way, it was an elder of this church and his wife years ago that introduced me to the Cheesecake Factory and started my almost addiction on it. But anyway, so we went there, and what I found out was they have good cheesecake, but the food, the rest of the food, is absolutely awesome, and so I like it a lot. But there's a challenge when you go to Cheesecake Factory, or really when you go anywhere. It's deciding what to eat, because at least at this particular restaurant, they will come out and they will lay a book right in front of you, and this is their menu. It's a thick book. It's actually divided into chapters. They had the brainstorm. They sell advertising in this menu. There's advertising in there, and so then you have to decide. Well, what am I going to get? What am I going to get? And so you kind of look through this menu, and you're like, I want to make an informed decision. The first time I went there, I asked the waiter. I said, "Well, what's good? What should I get?" And say, "Well, everything's good, but the meatloaf's really good. A lot of people get that." And I'm like, "I love meatloaf," so I got the meatloaf, and it was awesome. But sometimes you don't know what to get. You ask the waiter, maybe they have some suggestions. Maybe you ask the people sitting with you, right? Hey, what are you going to get? Because there's nothing worse than ordering something, but then you see what the person next to you got, and then you think, "I wish I had what they got." Right? You're looking at their food, wishing that you had ordered, because whatever anybody else has always looks better than what you have. And I think this is a picture of life. I think we're handed a menu, and it's a big menu, and it's full of options that promise satisfaction of different things that we could do, or different things we can pursue, or what we give ourselves to, or what we order. And we want to know the question, what is the one thing? What is the one thing that's going to really satisfy me? Again, we see other people order things, and we think, well, I wish I'd have gotten that. And so sometimes in life, we look at maybe things that other people have or decisions they've made and think, man, I wish if I'd have only done that, I'd be more satisfied. If I would have married that person, I'd be more satisfied. If I would have gotten this in this career path, I would be more satisfied. And we live sometimes with regret because we think that we didn't make the right choice. We didn't make the right choice, and we didn't get what we really wanted. And so I'm going to ask you some questions here this morning. And the first question I would ask you is, what is it that really brings satisfaction in life? What's the one thing that truly will satisfy us? Now, you probably know what I'm going to pose as the answer before we even start, right? But we're in this series where we're going through these I am statements of Jesus. And in these statements of Jesus, they tell us something about himself, but they also tell us how we can relate to him, and that he has some of the answers to the biggest questions that we face in life. And today the question we're going to be asking is how can we be satisfied? What is truly going to satisfy me? And so in John chapter 6, verse 35, this I am statement where Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever eats of me will never hunger again." We're going to come back to that, but we got to understand a little context first of what's going on in John chapter 6. And so at the beginning of John 6, Jesus has crossed over the Sea of Galilee. He gets to the other side, and there's this huge crowd that's waiting for him there. And this is when he's kind of at the peak of his popularity. He hasn't really revealed who exactly he was at this point, but he's been going all over doing miracles, and so he had quite a following at this point. And so here he was, and he's talking to this crowd, and there's 5,000, but probably more than that, because they only counted men back in those days. There's probably this crowd of maybe 10 to 15,000 people. And at some point in this day, Jesus realizes that, hey, these people are going to be getting hungry. He could look out and he could see some of them. Like he could tell that they were hungry just by looking at them. Kind of like I can tell when some of you are hungry just by looking at you when it gets close to 11:30 or whatever it is, right? And what do we know about people are hungry? Maybe you know this of yourself, or maybe somebody that you live with is, we get kind of like not real happy when we're angry or when we're hungry, right? We kind of aren't happy. I think this is why supermodels always look so angry when they go down the runway, right? It's because they weigh like 37 pounds, and they're just like, give me some food, I need to eat something. But this crowd is hungry, and Jesus knows it. And so in John 6:11, what Jesus does is he takes the loaves, these little loaves of bread, and he gives thanks, and he distributes them to those who were seated. And then don't miss this part. Look at what it says. It says, he gave them as much as they wanted. He gave them as much as they wanted. So he meets their physical hunger need by filling them. Well, the day goes by. Later that night, the crowds fall asleep right there on the hillside. But the crowds wake up the next morning and they start searching for Jesus. Where'd he go? Where'd he go? Now, why were they searching for him? Maybe they wanted to be close to him. Maybe they really were interested in what he was teaching. But more than likely, the vast majority of the people were looking for him because they were what? They were hungry again, right? It's breakfast time. And so they needed to eat some more. And so here we have a kind of a truth I think a lot of us have experienced, that there is a difference between being stuffed and being truly satisfied. I mean, the people were physically full, but they weren't satisfied, or at least it didn't last for very long. So if you're at a restaurant, Cheesecake Factory, whatever your favorite restaurant is, and you just don't know what to order, sometimes the server will help you, and he'll ask you the question. He'll say, well, how hungry are you? How hungry are you? Because that might determine what he might suggest that you eat. So I want to ask a question spiritually. How hungry are you? How hungry are you? I think for many of us, our souls are starving. We don't even realize it because we've just filled ourselves with all these cheap substitutes in life. We don't even realize that our souls, our spirits are malnourished, and we just stuff ourselves with things of the world, with distractions, with all kinds of things. And we don't even realize oftentimes that we really have this deep spiritual hunger. I don't know what it is for you. Maybe you're stuffing yourself with work, or maybe it's a relationship, or maybe it's sex, or maybe it's money, but it's masking just the true hunger that God has made each of us to have, and that is a hunger for him. And only he can fully satisfy this deep hunger that we have. But we just keep stuffing ourselves full of stuff so much that if we're not careful, we'll lose an appetite for the most important thing. That's why something like, through the history of the church, something like fasting has been so important and has been talked about so much by the spiritual giants of the past. Because if we go for a time when we do without something, whether it's food or social media or technology or whatever it might be, if we go for a time without it, then we're more sensitive to the deeper yearnings and hungers of our heart. And so we are here in John chapter 6, and Jesus wants to move this crowd from the hunger pains of the stomach to a deeper hunger, the hunger of the soul. Look at verse 27, chapter 6, is what he says. Now they've asked him for food, they've asked him for more food, but listen to what he says. He says no. He says, don't pursue food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. Jesus understands that they're searching for what they believe in their minds is satisfaction. But he knows there's a deeper hunger in them that is never going to be filled by just food alone. And so they ask him for more food, and yeah, he could have done that. He could have made bread from heaven rain down upon them. He could have done that, but he didn't want them to miss out on the deeper satisfaction that they were yearning for. And so understand that the satisfaction that we're wanting to be filled with has to start with knowing what it is that we're hungry for. Knowing what it is we're hungry for. And you've had this debate, undoubtedly. Maybe some of you will have it after church today. Well, what do you feel like eating? You want to go to El Porchero? No, I don't much feel like Mexican. Or where do you want to go? And if you are eating something that you're not really hungry for, it's not good. It's not good. So I'm curious. I'm curious, like the people that Jesus wanted to ask this question are, what are you hungry for? What are you really hungry for? Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, he said, now if you hunger and if you thirst for righteousness, like you'll be filled. An older translation says that you'll be satisfied. You'll be satisfied. And so we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're really hungry for? Because being satisfied means that we're going to be hungry for the right things. Now, I think the answer to this question probably is found in what you're already eating. Because I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but our appetites tend to grow in the direction of the things that we're already consuming. Right? And you probably know this if you've been on a diet, you know that this is true. Like, for example, you're trying to do one of the most effective things to lose weight, and you're trying to eliminate carbs and sugar out of your life. And you know that's not very easy. And you may do it, and the first day may go okay, but the second and the third and the fourth, there can be these actual withdrawals. Sugar is one of the most addictive substances there is. I was reading this past week that in our day and time, the average American will eat an average of 2 to 3 pounds of sugar in different forms, but sugar, 2 to 3 pounds a week. 100 years ago, a person was lucky to consume 5 pounds of sugar in an entire lifetime. And we have all of this sugar, and so let's say we try to go without that, and we become irritable, and we become moody, and your body wants these things, but it knows that they're not good for it. They're not healthy, but you still hunger for them. And so I guess when we think of, well, what is our spiritual diet? What do we spend times ingesting it or taking into our bodies? And sometimes there's really not much of a hunger for God because I think we don't pursue it. We don't strive for that. And so we need to ask ourselves, what are we eating? Maybe you'll find right now that you have a stronger appetite for all kinds of different things than you do for God. Maybe a stronger appetite to gain more possessions or for worldly success or for entertainment or diversion or distraction or whatever it might be. What is your diet? Because what we are taking in oftentimes will determine what we want more of. I was reading this past week this bizarre experiment that I don't know, like you couldn't pay me enough to do some of these things, but a bizarre experiment with rats where scientists actually took a little electrode and implanted it in the tiny brain of the rat in an area that's thought to produce pleasure. Like it's a satisfaction, pleasure producing area in the brain. And then they would put this rat into a cage. And in this cage there were 2 levers. And one of the levers, if he would hit that one, it would activate this pleasure electrode in his brain. And the other lever, it would actually give the rat some food. And almost without fail, every single time, the rat would hit the lever which activated the pleasure center in his brain. In fact, this would go on so long that the rat would actually starve to death because he didn't ever get the real food. So I think the question for us is like, what lever will we choose? Will we choose the actual nourishment and sustaining things that God can only give us? Or will we continue just to hit the lever which will produce a never-ending stream of pleasure in our minds? What are we eating? So another question, you're sitting at the table and you're trying to decide what to get. The server will come around and there's a third question sometimes they'll ask, and sometimes they'll be nice. But if they're waiting on me, they'll be kind of exasperated, and they'll be like, have you decided yet? Like, do you know what you want to order yet? And I'll say, I do, but why don't you start over here? Like, start with somebody else, because by the time it comes around, I'll figure it out, right? But here's the thing. These crowds are following him. And this is the question that he wants to ask them. Have they decided? Have they decided? See, they were, and this happened throughout his life, but they were showing up because they wanted a good show. They were not showing up because they wanted to understand him better. They wanted something from him. And so that's why they were following him. And so he wants to know, are you coming just for the free bread? Are you coming for the show? Or are you coming because you want to know me? Because you want a relationship with me? Are you coming because you want more from him? Or do you come to church because you want more of him? And so in verse 34, they say to Jesus, now, Jesus, from now on, give us this bread, give us this food. And they still think that he's talking about physical bread. And that's when we come to this verse 35 of chapter 6, when Jesus says, I am the bread. Like, you want bread, I will give you bread, but it's not how you think it's going to be. He says, I am the bread. And if you come to me, you'll never get hungry. You'll be physically satisfied. You'll be spiritually satisfied. And so come to me, because I am the bread. A couple things culturally you got to understand about why he talks about bread. And one thing would be that unlike our day, bread back then was it was an entree. It was like the main event, right? Like today, it's just it's a side thing, or it's an appetizer. In fact, probably you've been sitting at a table, like maybe you're at Olive Garden or wherever, and they bring out the free breadsticks, and you're chomping down on them, and somebody says to you, now don't do what? Don't fill up on bread, right? Because the main thing's coming. Don't fill up on bread, because the best thing is coming. In that day and time, bread largely was the main thing. So Jesus says, I am the bread. What was he saying? He's saying, I am the main thing. I am the main course. I am not just an appetizer. I am the main thing. And the other thing about bread back in that day is that it was available to everybody. Everybody had access to bread. Again, it was the staple of life. If you were among the poorer people, you would make bread out of barley. If you were among those who had some funds, then you would make bread out of wheat. But everybody had access to bread. And so Jesus says, I am the bread. In other words, I am here for everybody. Everybody can have access to me. Now, remember last week I told you that these words, when Jesus said, I am, these would have been very inflammatory. Basically, Jesus was saying, I am God. We talked about how in the Old Testament, when God revealed his name, it was basically, I am. Moses said, who should I tell the Israelites sent me? And God said, tell him, I am sent you. I am who I am. And so when Jesus says these words, I am, he's basically calling himself God. And when he does that, it's time for them to make a decision. Time for him to make a decision. And so this is the first time here in John chapter 6, verse 35, the first time that we know that Jesus just outright said, I am God, I and the Father are one. And this calls for a decision. He drew a sign in the land, a line in the sand. Now look at verse 41. It says, now at this time, the Jews began to grumble about him, because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. And they said, isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph? Like we know his mom, we know his dad. How can he make such a claim to be God? But Jesus presses the issue even more, just in case there's any doubt that he's making this claim. Look, verse 47, he says, I tell you the truth. He who believes in me has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your forefathers, they ate manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and never die. And then he goes on in verse 51, just like God sent manna from heaven, God the Father has sent me from heaven. But here's the difference. He said, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anybody eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. And then he goes on in verse 53 to say, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Now, with that whole exchange of what he was saying, he's saying, you need to eat and drink of me. You need to be filled with me. You need to be satisfied with me. Now, I understand that to our modern ears, and even back then, that sounded a little bit strange. It sounds like, well, kind of cannibalistic, right? And there were some charges against the church early in the days because of some of these teachings that, well, they're cannibals. And of course, that's not at all what he's talking about. He's trying to communicate a spiritual truth to them that only he can satisfy. And he wants you to understand, he wants me to understand that just as we eat physical food to sustain us and to satisfy our physical health, we need to eat of him to sustain and to edify our spiritual selves, our souls. And so here's what Jesus is looking for from his followers. He's saying, don't just look to me to provide food for your physical needs, but look to me to fill a deeper satisfaction. And Jesus says, no, they're going to ask for more bread to eat, but Jesus says no. He says no. Like, I could do that, but no. He said, I want you to have me. And I want you to see that is enough. Now, listen really carefully, because I think this is how you know that it's for real. And so the question I would ask you is, are you following Jesus from what you can get from him, or are you following Jesus because you want more of him? You want a real relationship with him. What happens in your soul and your spirit, for example, when bread does not fall from heaven in your life? Because when that happens, there is a sort of revealing that takes place, and it shows what your relationship with him is really made of. When God doesn't do the thing that you think he should do in your life. God doesn't answer the prayer in the way that you think it ought to be answered. Jesus doesn't come through for you in a way that you feel like he should. It's decision time. You're going to find out what your relationship with God is really all about. And so in some of the most difficult passages of John, verse 60, the disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Like, who can accept this? They weren't saying this is difficult to understand. They were just saying this is hard stuff. Like, this is discipleship stuff. And so verse 66, it says, from this time on, many of his disciples, not the 12, but the larger crowd following him, but from this time on, many of his disciples, his followers, turned back, and they no longer followed him. So he's kind of weeded out the crowd. He was discovering who was coming just because they were hungry or because they wanted to see a show, or who really wanted what he truly had to offer. They were just wanting the butter and the jelly, and they thought that came with the bread. But the truth is that it's important for us to recognize in ourselves, like, we can follow Jesus. We can follow Jesus without really being satisfied by him. You can come to church each week, you can read your Bibles maybe, and not find satisfaction in him. We can still be trying to find satisfaction in other places, like ultimate satisfaction. And so, like we talked about last week, we can set Jesus up on this sort of altar here, and around him we have all these other things that we're trying to use as well. And yet he says, I am the main course. I am the one. I am the bread. And so it separates those who want to follow him because he is the Lord and because he deserves to be followed, and those who just are in it for what we can get out of it. Missionaries in the third world countries have a term that they've come to use to describe some Christians, and they call them rice Christians. Rice Christians. And the idea is that they've observed that there are all kinds of people who will quickly convert to Christianity in those countries just to get some rice, some physical benefit. They want some food, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's why we have meal packing parties. That's why we try to help and feed other people. But the problem is that once the rice is gone, they found so are the people, and so they call them rice Christians, right? Not Rice Krispies, right? Rice Christians. Okay, let's not get that confused. Now, I'm sure that we're much different than that, right? Like, I mean, if all your, so to speak, if all your goodies were gone, would Jesus be enough? If there were no butter, peanut butter or jelly in your life, could you still be satisfied with just the bread of life? Or are we following him because we want to get something from him? There are a lot of churches that build big churches and attract a lot of people on the butter and jelly teaching, right? They're just all about, listen, if you follow Jesus, you're going to be healthy, you're going to be wealthy, you're all going to get free bread, plenty to eat. That's what God wants to do for everybody, just to rain down manna on us constantly. But there's a lot of people who want to hear that, but that's just not what Jesus said. In fact, he said, in this world, you're going to have trouble. In this world, you're going to have trouble. So when hard times come, it's a way of revealing like what we're really in it for. The butter and the jelly, or is the bread enough? But this crowd, a large part of them leave. They go back home. If Jesus isn't going to be their heavenly ATM, then they're out. They're gone. They're going to go back home. And so look what Jesus does. He turns to the 12 disciples now, verse 67. He says, well, you don't want to leave too, do you? It's a hard question. I wish we could have heard how he said that. I mean, there are many different ways he could have said that. He could have said it out of frustration and anger, like, well, you're not going to leave too, are you? I don't know. I'm not sure that he said it like that. My hunch is that he kind of posed that question with a sort of a sense of sadness and disappointment. Because here's a great crowd of people who are coming to Jesus for physical bread, but yet they have this deeper spiritual yearning that they don't even understand. And there Jesus is right there all along, what they really want, what they need, and yet they leave. And so he asks his disciples, you're not going to leave too, are you? And Simon Peter in verse 68 answers, Lord, I love his answer, Lord, to whom shall we go? Like, where should we go? For you alone have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. In that moment, Peter got it. In that moment, hopefully the others got it as well. He's like, if there's nothing else on the menu that will satisfy Jesus, you are enough. Everything else, by comparison, falls short. Maybe some of you are here this morning, you're not really hungry for the bread of life. Maybe you went to church as a kid and maybe you weren't really into it. It seemed a little bit boring to you. And maybe you quit going just as soon as you could. A lot of reasons why we talk so much about how so many of our young people, when they graduate from high school, they kind of fall out of the church. It's a very difficult thing to understand. But some of us have been like that. And yet God calls us to say, there's so much more to this. There's so much more. I was reading about starving children in places like Africa and talking about how oftentimes they don't have enough food to eat. And they'll literally use up all of the fat that they have stored. They'll use up all their muscles until literally all that's left is skin and bones. And you've probably seen pictures like this. Their stomachs are bloated and eventually their black hair will turn orange or red and it will fall out and their skin will dry out. They're just grievously malnourished. But here's the thing. Another thing that happens to these children that I guess wasn't aware of is that they lose their appetite when they get to that when they get to that point. They're starving to death, but they're not hungry for the only thing that can save their physical lives. So if you were to offer them a piece of bread, they'd push it away. They'd turn their head in the other direction. They don't want it. And I do think that's a picture of what happens to a lot of us spiritually sometimes. We starve our spiritual lives. We ignore God. We neglect God. We're so consumed and focused on all this other stuff. We're starving to death that we're not hungry. We're not hungry for God. So it's interesting to me that what the helpers in Africa would do is that if they would encounter children or a child like this, they would actually take some bread and they would force these children to open up their mouths. And if they needed to, they would literally force the food to go down their throats and to swallow it. And they say if they can just get the kids to take just a few bites, their hunger will come back and they'll be hungry again. I don't know how to make somebody hungry for things of God if they're not. Like I wish I could kind of, so to speak, sort of force feed some people to get that hunger there again. But I don't know how to do that. And some of you, I long so much that whatever the thing that you're searching for, that maybe you've never really identified, maybe you really have never named it, is the thing that you're most neglecting and ignoring in your life. The Bible says, taste and see that the Lord is good. And if we would just do that, we find satisfaction only in Jesus Christ. And oftentimes, again, we're sitting at this table, we're flipping through the menu, we're saying, well, what else is there? Is there something else? There's got to be more than this. What will satisfy me? But ultimately, scripturally, and God knows, and Jesus knew that day with that crowd, ultimately, Jesus is the only thing that will really satisfy us. Now, like you say, well, like, okay, like whatever, Chris, it's a good sermon, I get it, but what does this mean in real life, right? Like, well, let me tell you what this means in real life. So I hesitate to use this example because I do not want anybody to confuse the fact that I am a rabid anti-Patriot fan, all right? I do not like the New England Patriots. And I am hoping, not that I really care, but it's not that I'm a Chiefs fan, but I just hope the Patriots will lose. I'm sorry, I know, like some of you are like, okay, but listen to this. So you have, yeah. If y'all start throwing stuff at me, I'm just going to, so. Several years ago, now, having said that, I fully acknowledge he's a great quarterback, and by all accounts, I've heard he's a pretty decent guy, but it was interesting that here he's got everything, Super Bowl rings, has dated a string of supermodels, even married one of them, a multi-million-dollar, he's got everything that you could think a person would ever want to be satisfied. A few years ago, he was on 60 Minutes, and he was interviewed by Steve Kroft on 60 Minutes, and yet at some point in the interview, Tom Brady asked a question of Steve Kroft. Tom Brady asked, why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings? And I still think there's something greater out there for me. I mean, maybe a lot of people would say, hey, this is what it's all about. I reached my goal, my dream, my life. But me? He says, I've got to think there's got to be more to this, more than this. I mean, this can't be all it's cracked up to be. Kroft asked him what the answer might possibly be. And this is how he replied. Tom Brady said, well, what's the answer? I wish I knew. He said, I love playing football. I love being quarterback for this team. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of other parts about me that I'm still trying to satisfy. Troy Aikman, quarterback for the Cowboys for a long time, he wondered the same thing. He just led the Cowboys to his first Super Bowl victory. And he said he sat up in his hotel room after the night that they won, and his teammates and everybody was down below celebrating and partying. And he said, I sat up in my hotel room staring out the window. And he said, I just couldn't help but think, is this all it is? He said, I just had this emptiness inside of me. Now, I'm not saying that that's how it always will be. Certainly, there are situations in life where we can feel some satisfaction. But when we are looking for ultimate, like our whole life revolves around a person or a job or a thing or whatever it is, I promise you that God will not allow you to find ultimate satisfaction in that thing. It just won't. So one of the questions that sometimes gets asked when we're trying to order off the menu, server maybe doesn't ask you this, but you ask it of yourself, and you look, and some restaurants, they don't put it on the menu, so you got to ask, and that's like, well, like I'd love to have this, but what does it cost? What does it cost? Because I'd love to have this filet mignon every single time I go here, but it's $45, and it's too expensive. I can't afford it. It costs too much. I'm not going to order that. And so here's the sad news. The sad news is that the one meal, the thing that truly satisfies, the bread of life, costs more than any of us have. We could never, ever afford it. We don't have enough. We could give everything that we have, and it still would not be enough. But the good news is that it's already been paid for. Check has already been picked up. Price has been completely covered. The meal is offered to you for free. The only meal that truly satisfies for all of eternity is free to us, but it cost Jesus everything. So in just a moment, we're going to offer you a time to take communion. And listen, this is a free meal offered for everybody. Sometimes it's misunderstood that, well, I got to be a member of the church to participate in communion or whatever. No, this is for you. This is between you and God. It's free. It doesn't matter. You think, I'm not spiritual enough, or I don't come to church enough, or whatever it is. This is a meal that's offered for you by Jesus. And with this meal, we are reminded every week. That's why we do this every week in our church. Like there are people that come here and say, well, why do you do communion every single week? The church I came from, we did it maybe once a month or maybe once a quarter or whatever. And we just do it because we need to be reminded. And it's interesting to me that this communion supper, a little cup of juice and a little wafer, is oftentimes the most satisfying meal of the week. Because when we take this, when we remember what Jesus did for us, we're asking him, the bread of life, to fill us, to meet the deepest needs of our heart, the inner longings of our souls. And he has promised to do that.